Yes, it is time for more insanity when it comes to chronology. Today I want to talk about, is it possible that the Hellenistic time period is the exact same time period as the Renaissance? Now I get it. I know initially this sounds insane. And the reason why this initially sounds insane is because the Hellenistic period takes place in the 300s BC era, whereas the Renaissance happens to take place in the 1500s AD era. Right? So we have 1800 years between these two events. So initially, right off the bat, it seems like it would be impossible to misconstrue these two periods of time as being the exact same period. Because, I mean, there's 1800 years between them. What the hell is going on? What do you mean they're the same period of time? Well, what if I told you this? What if mainstream history is just wrong? And we've basically been covering that for almost a year now on this channel. So yes, mainstream history is wrong. Regardless of what kind of historian you are, you can honestly admit that yes, it is possible that there are aspects of mainstream history that are wrong. Every historian should be able to admit that. Any historian that does not admit that, just walk away from that person. I mean, you can choke them out a little bit, just but then walk away, because that person is in la la land. Those people are insane, because it's impossible, literally impossible, scientifically impossible for us to know every single perfect little detail about history. So if anybody ever answers that question as a, no, we know everything in history, it's impossible that we could make a mistake. If anybody says that, you just start slapping them and just, and just, like I said, okay, all right. Anyway, don't listen to those people, because those people are crazy. Those people have lost their mind. They are not existing in the realm of science. So we know that the answer to the question, is it possible that mainstream history has made mistakes, is a resounding yes. Well, then, of course, it begs the next couple of questions. Well, what are they wrong in? And how wrong are they? So this is what we are going to talk about today. Now, generally in history, people think, yeah, maybe we're off by a decade or two on something, or maybe a year, or something like that. That's basically how the mainstream historians operate. Right? They're not interested in changing, centuries around, certainly not changing millennia. So when they want to make a little bit of a course correction, they will only adjust the minute details of a chronology. They will never shift huge blocks of chronology to accommodate real evidence. That never happens, right? So these, you can't rely on these people. But the evidence is what it is. So for a quick example, and this actually does pertain to our situation here in this show, we have scientific evidence now, like an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence now, that shows the Dark Age period never existed. And by the Dark Age period, I am talking about the period up there in the European Dark Ages. And I've covered that on other shows, and we'll do more later, but I only bring that up, or this particular situation up, because it does pertain to this supposed 1800 year time block that was added to mainstream history out of nowhere. So let's get into it. Now, I know this sounds insane. How did historians accidentally add 1800 years into mainstream chronology? I mean, how do you even do that? How is that possible? Don't we have books, tomes, carvings, archaeological evidence that proves that this 1800 years really did exist and should be in the mainstream historical narrative? And the answer is no. We have nothing like that. All the evidence right now that is used to substantiate all of these ancient periods in time, and it doesn't matter what the time period really is, all of this evidence, or I should say basically 99% of this evidence, comes from documentation that magically shows up during the Renaissance period. Now, you also might be wanting to ask, well, I mean, what about all of the archaeological evidence that we have? And to that I say, what archaeological evidence? Like, how is anybody proving that any archaeological evidence that has been discovered actually relates to any of the civilizations in question? Right? If you really dig down into it and you ask extraordinarily basic critical thinking questions, archaeologists and their discoveries immediately fall apart. It's entirely possible, and at this point in time, it's essentially been proven that a vast majority of the conclusions made by archaeologists are essentially wrong because they're based on nothing. Like I said, if archaeologists are trying to calibrate their archaeological discoveries to all of these books that have been found magically during the Renaissance, like, is that really good science? I mean, should we be doing this? Especially since we know for a fact that a lot of the stuff that comes out of the Renaissance period, like I've already said, is literally forgeries. All that stuff is manufactured. And even mainstream agrees with a lot of it, which makes this whole situation even funnier. But a lot of mainstream people choose to ignore all of the evidence that shows that all of these books, all of these records are fake. So what do you do with an archaeologist that literally goes against the face of real science, ignores it, throws it to the side, and then makes a claim that some particular building or artifact is from, 500 BC? How do they come to this conclusion with a straight face? We have no information with this. Now, of course, you may also be asking, well, what about radiometric dating and dendrochronology and all of those things? What about them? We have no scientifically reliable dating mechanism at all on this planet. And that's just the scientific fact. Don't let any of these people fool you into saying that all of these dates that they are magically getting out of any of these processes are real. There are so many problems with these processes. I mean, you essentially might as well just completely ignore them. It's amazing. I mean, hopefully one day scientists are able to figure out a really good methodology that will give us the real dates of when an artifact existed. Hopefully that happens. But as it stands right now, we know for a fact, and that's a scientific fact, that all of our current dating methods do not give any kind of accurate date whatsoever. All right, now I'm not going to get into any of that stuff because that's an entirely other show and I don't have time for that. And I realize that some of this might be hard to hear, but you don't need to take my word for it. I'll do a show on the horrible problems with the dating methods later, but you don't even need to wait for that. There are already tons of really great scientists out there who have written papers on this, who have proven this experimentally. All of this evidence is fairly easy to find, even on, a clear Google search. Like, it's out there, it's not hidden. Anyway, given the fact that we have no reliable way to date anything in ancient times, this does indeed open the door for the scientific possibility of large gaps of time being added to the chronology. Now, I'm postulating 1800 years here. That's pretty insane. By the way, it's not me that figured this out. I am just sharing with you guys what I have found because this stuff is absolutely amazing and it has completely changed my view on history, and it has also started to make history actually finally start to make sense. The electric universe theory, plasma, all of that stuff, that was one huge step in the right direction to trying to rectify all of the problems with the historical narrative. But there's still a chronological problem with respect to how that community looks at the historical narrative. The problem they run into is that when they start talking about catastrophism, they are using the mainstream historical data, right? They are following mainstream chronology. And that, of course, is going to affect calculations for, say, how long a particular plasma event took place. If you are using mainstream chronology, you have a stretched out chronology that is going to give you false time periods. And I honestly believe there are some issues within that community that pop up because they are not paying attention to real chronology. All right, anyway, neither here nor there. The main point here is that the next ingredient to trying to put together a real history is looking at chronology. All right, so yeah, I've ranted long enough. Let's get into it. All right, so what I want to do is I want to actually quote from a book that I read a little bit ago, and it's amazing. It's called Redating Ancient Greece, 500 BC equals 1300 AD, and it's by a guy named Sylvian Tristan. Now, this book is well written, and it has fantastic pieces of evidence in it, and it gives you a completely different picture of chronology using real, actual scientific methods, right? This is not garbage. The title of this book, the 500 BC equals 1300 AD, this was not just some random date pulled out of his butt, right? This date comes up due to the science of chronology. So I'm going to quote from some of this book, and we'll go through bits and pieces of it, and we'll see what kind of a picture we can put together relative to ancient Greece and the Renaissance, and how those two periods may actually be the exact same point in time. All right, this section is called the Hellenistic period and the Renaissance. As we have already seen, the period 340 to 320 BC is a pivotal moment in ancient Greece. The arrival of the Macedonians, first in Byzantium, then in Athens, changed the face of the region and triggered the beginning of the so-called Hellenistic period, during which many Greeks emigrated throughout the Mediterranean area, spreading Greek language and culture throughout the Mediterranean basin and also in many parts of Asia. The term Hellenistic period should not be confused with the Hellenic period, which refers to classical Greece, and that would be the 5th and 4th centuries BC in Scaligean chronology. The Hellenistic period came right after the classical period, from the late 4th century BC to the late 1st century BC. As we are going to see, these key events find their counterpart 1800 years later, with the arrival of the Ottoman Turks and the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the ensuing Renaissance period, when many Greek scholars were forced into emigration and, quote, ancient Greek texts were suddenly rediscovered in Western Europe, mainly in Italy. Now, I'm going to skip over a few parts in this book, and I'm just going to focus on the Hellenistic and the Renaissance period. But one of the arguments that puts or that links these two periods of time happening in the same period of time instead of 1800 years apart is the fact that we have Alexander of Macedonian, Alexander the Great. He actually has a historical duplicate in the 1400s called Mebed II. Now, Mebed II and Alexander the Great, oddly enough, have extremely similar stories in history, and I mean extremely. So, for example, they are both sons of a father who attempted to conquer Constantinople or Byzantium, depending on your period of time, and they fail. Then their sons, which are Alexander the Great and Mehmed II, they actually do end up conquering the city. And there's tons of other historical similarities between these two people. The reason why this is brought up is to show that it's not just that we are trying to make the claim that the Renaissance is the same thing as the Hellenistic period and all other history surrounding it doesn't matter, not even close. It's the exact opposite. All the history that surrounds these two time periods, oddly enough, they find phantom duplicates within each other. Right? They find conquering duplicates, they find intellectual duplicates, etc., etc. It gets absolutely insane. I'm not going to cover the Alexander stuff. We'll do that on a different show. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that in history, we find a lot of weird coincidences between the Renaissance period of time and the Hellenistic period of time. All right, let's keep going with the book. All right, the next section is called the Hellenistic period. First of all, as is often the case in history, the name, quote, Hellenistic period was first coined by historians as late as the 19th century. How do you like that? The Hellenistic name is not something the Greeks were using back in the day. This is very much a brand new term. And we find this a lot in history. There are so many terms that we think are ancient, old, thousands of years, but the reality is a lot of these terms that we give to civilizations back in the day, these are relatively recent identities given to ancient cultures. So don't forget that. All right, back to the thing. It is a very recent name that was never used in the nearly 2 millennia, which supposedly elapsed between the end of the period and the creation of the term by historians. The quick definition of the Hellenistic period is a, quote, period in history defined as the time between the death of Alexander the Great and the rise of Roman domination. During this time, Greek culture was dominant throughout the Mediterranean." Unquote. It was also an age characterized by many advances in philosophy, science, literature, and art. Libraries in places such as Alexandria in Egypt and Pergamon helped to make these advances possible. Incidentally, the city of Pergamon today, part of Turkey, gave its name to the word parchment via the Latin word pergamenium and the French term parchemin. In a nutshell, the Hellenistic period is the spread of Greek Hellenic culture and the mixture of Greeks with other populations, beginning in the late 4th century BC. The Renaissance. Just like the name Hellenistic period is a 19th century creation, the term Renaissance was coined as late as the 1830s. Don't you just love that, how all of these names were created recently, but they are played off as if they are the true ancient names that the people back in the day used for themselves. Like, not even close, right? Like the Mayan did not call themselves the Mayan, for example. You know, it's just funny. Okay, anyway, where the hell was I? All right. The Renaissance was coined in the late 1830s. It first appeared in English in 1837 and in French in 1840. It seems that the term had been used once in Italian under the form of Renaissatia by the Italian painter Giorgio Vasari in a 1568 book, but the term was never widely used until the first half of the 19th century. According to the Old Oxford Dictionary, the Renaissance is defined as the revival of European art and literature under the influence of the classical models in the 14th through 16th centuries. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary gives a slightly different definition, writing that the Renaissance is, quote, "the period of European history between the 14th and the 17th centuries when there was a new interest in science and in ancient art and literature, especially in Italy." This, quote, new interest situation is one of the funny things with chronology. So one of the reasons why we can make claims that the concept of, say, the Dark Ages are ridiculous, because one of the things that we find in the archaeological record is that we do not actually have physical evidence for that 1,000-year time block that we, kind of attribute to the Dark Ages. Generally, I know you can argue with me on the, the date range. I'm just giving a general range. But what we find, archaeology does not flow with 1,000 years worth of history. Essentially, we don't have 1,000 years worth of history in the ground. It doesn't exist. Right? We do not have 1,000 years of houses, toilets, infrastructure. There's none of this. We have one layer. One layer. That's it. We do not have 3 different layers like archaeologists try to spin off. They don't even they don't even admit to 3 layers anymore because it doesn't exist. But we should actually find 3 layers under the ground if mainstream archaeology and history was correct. All right, yeah, okay. Let's keep going. Where the hell was I? All right. The opinion of many scholars is that the Renaissance began with Italian humanists rediscovering, quote, ancient authors writing in Latin and Greek. More particularly, many scholars place the beginning of the Renaissance with Petrarch, 1304 to 74, sometimes dubbed the, quote, father of humanism, who in 1345 rediscovered letters written by Cicero, a Roman orator who lived between 106 BC and 43 BC in the Scaligerine textbook. See, don't you just love how random people are just like, oh, hey, look, I found a bunch of Roman letters from this orator guy. Yeah, it says that I own this church now. That's basically what happens. Okay, anyway, moving on. Another example of an Italian humanist is Poggio Bracciolini, who apparently discovered Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, in a German monastery in 1417. Lucretius was a Roman poet and philosopher who allegedly lived from 99 BC to 55 BC. Were these Roman authors truly ancient at the time, or were they rather recent? Greek authors started to be translated into Latin very late, at the turn of the 15th century. Manuel Chrysolaris, a Byzantine Greek from Constantinople, was a pioneer in the introduction of, quote, ancient Greek literature to Italy. Chrysolaris arrived in Florence in 1397. Scholars assume that no one had studied Greek in Italy for the 7 centuries which preceded Chrysolaris' arrival in Florence. Chrysolaris is known to have translated Homer, for example, and also Plato's Republic into Latin. Plato's Republic was apparently translated in the year 1400 to 03. This was about 15 years before Plato wrote his own Laws. Laws being an actual book he wrote in the sense of a philosophical book. He didn't write a constitution or anything like that. Plato is important, though, to this story because, and I'll do a show on this later, but a quick little overview of who Plato is. Plato is one of these guys who starts back up the Neoplatonic Academy during the Renaissance. So I'll just say that there is a direct connection between Plato and Plato. And right now, if you're wondering if their names sound similar, correct. That might actually matter. All right, so anyway, let's get back into this. Okay. At the beginning of the 15th century, Plato was approximately 45 years of age. Interestingly, it is generally assumed that Plato wrote his Republic when he was about 45 years of age too. Our own assumption is that Plato's Republic was written by Plato at age 45. If our theory is correct, it was then a brand new book that Chrysalis translated into Latin, not an ancient classic nearly 2 millennia old. So basically what we're saying is that Chrysalis, when he translates Plato, what he's actually doing is he's translating a work by Plato under the pseudonym of Plato. Yeah, it gets crazy, man, but there's tons of scientific evidence for this. Like, it changes everything, right? Because right now we think of people like, Plato, Aristotle, etc., all of those philosophers, we all imagine them Greek, and they all wear togas, and they all lived, 2,000+ years ago, right? That may not be the case at all. All of this philosophical writing that we give credit to for the Greeks way back in the day, it's entirely possible that all of this work was done during the Renaissance. So let's keep going. Was the Renaissance the rediscovery and translation of extremely ancient Latin and Greek books which had been forgotten for many centuries, or rather the discovery of recent Latin works and the translation into Latin of very recent, not to say contemporaneous, Greek works? Here is the hypothesis. What the data suggests here is that Greek culture, its philosophy, science, and literature, did not spread twice around the Mediterranean, but only once. Either right after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, or possibly in the decades or perhaps the centuries preceding it, i.e. during the Golden Age of Greece. This would imply that the Hellenistic period and the Renaissance period are actually more or less one and the same thing. This would imply that Alexandria in Egypt was founded much later than historians think, either right after Mehmed II took Constantinople, or a few decades or perhaps a few centuries before the event. If it was indeed Alexander who gave its name to the city, then this must have happened as late as the 15th century. The reason why Alexander would have given his name to Alexandria possibly, like in the 12 or 1300s AD, is because the people who would have named Alexandria, they would have called Mehmet II Skanderberg. Skanderberg, in the language that they were speaking, would have turned into Alexander. So there's a lot of language kind of morphism going on, but that's extraordinarily normal, right? That's a scientific fact. Anyways, that's just another bullet point showing the discrepancy between these two time periods and how they actually connect. Yeah, it gets really crazy. We'll do a show on Alexander the Great sometime as well. That's a whole insane area, actually. All right, anyway, where were we at? Greek works were translated into Latin at this time only because they were either recent or contemporary books. And there were not two, but only one wave of Greek immigrants who spread Greek culture in the Mediterranean basin in the past. Which makes sense, because one of the problems that we have with the Dark Ages is that we have civilization in the area of the Mediterranean and in the European area. Basically, civilization stops and dies for no reason at all in the very early 1st century AD. Then, a little over 1,000 years later, civilization literally picks up where it left off 1,000 years before. What sense does that make? Does that really sound believable, that suddenly, for no reason at all, civilization just stops, goes into a dark age, and then everybody just picks right back up where they left off immediately after 1,000 years? This is what mainstream historians literally believe. That is their history. They honestly believe that happened. Even worse, just a quick example of the ridiculousness of the Dark Ages, we find that the people who pick civilization back up, 1000 AD on up, what happens is they actually just continue to build not only in the identical style of their ancestors from 1,000 years ago, but somehow these people are even able to match the chemical fingerprint of the construction materials. That's right. This is a scientifically proved fact that we have a 1,000-year gap, and that somehow magically all of the people in the early Renaissance suddenly picked up exactly where everybody left off, down to the chemical fingerprint of the construction material. I can't, that's crazy. It's absolutely insane. That's what mainstream people believe. You have to be out of your mind to believe the mainstream narrative. Okay, anyway, you get it. If all of this evidence is true, it was not a revival of ancient Greek authors, but rather the continuation of the true golden age of Greece, which had occurred not in the 5th century BC, but rather in the 14th century AD. Now, the next section of this book is called Destroying the Theory. And this is what I really love about this author, is he goes out of his way to try and prove the postulate, of Hellenistic Greece and the Renaissance being one and the same. He's trying to disprove this theory. He's not just trying to promote it. He's not just throwing evidence out there and not actually looking at it. No, instead, we actually do look at it through a critical eye in an effort to destroy the theory. Because if the theory is correct, that means our history is entirely messed up, right? We have no choice but to admit that everything we believe is just completely wrong. All of it. Not just some of it, all of it. So he's trying, this next section, he's going to try and destroy the theory. So he's going to start laying out more evidence. So let's get into it. All right, destroying the theory. Let us posit that our theory is false. In that case, we have to admit that Greek culture and Greek people spread around the Mediterranean twice in history, that these events are closely linked to the conquest of Byzantium, Constantinople in both cases, that the first conqueror failed in both cases, and that his son succeeded in both cases, that both Alexander the Great and Skanderberg illustrated themselves as military commanders in very similar ways, and that Athens was conquered a few years later by another conqueror of the same ethnicity in both cases. Let us add that the first conquerors both died age 46, and that their sons both appear to have taken Byzantium and Constantinople when they were in their early 20s. And that the two sets of events once again occurred at a time interval of nearly 1,800 years. What this is highlighting, for those of you who are not aware, is a thing called phantom duplicates throughout our history. So one of the things that seems to have happened with the chronologers of the various ages is, especially during the Renaissance period, mainly during the Renaissance period, we have a time in history to where all of a sudden having and owning old books or old artifacts becomes, a hot topic. Basically, everybody is trying to get their hands on some form of antiquity. Other people during the Renaissance period of time are trying to get their hands on books, scrolls, whatever, that will allow them to back up claims to ownership of various items, things like a throne, land, a church, etc. So what this creates during the Renaissance is essentially there's a supply and a demand situation. So as humans do, if there is a demand, people will go out of their way to make a supply because you can gain a lot of money doing so. So right here in the Renaissance, we suddenly find an entire industry that is making a lot of money. Make no mistake, the word industry 100% applies to the Renaissance with respect to old books and stuff like that. We find a huge industry pop up to where suddenly books are appearing out of nowhere. But what was really happening is that people were just forging books. They were just making stuff up. And as they were doing this, they started creating large gaps in time. Now, they weren't doing this on accident. They were creating these gaps to substantiate claims of power, of various kinds of power for different kinds of people. So what they would do is they would take a contemporary event that was well documented to some degree, like somebody conquering Byzantium, right, for example. Then they would take that campaign and then they would throw it back 1,000 years. And they would just change the names and they would just change little details here and there, but the overall aspect would remain the same. And then they would just change the date. And so you would have basically a phantom duplicate of an event that would have taken place, say, in 1300 AD. Now it's suddenly taking place now in 500 BC. And who the hell's going to call them out on that, right? No one. Not everybody. The majority of people back then realized that forgeries were happening everywhere, but it could be tough to prove it. Now, interestingly enough, there were a lot of people proving some of this stuff wrong. That was definitely happening. Don't forget, it's not like every single forgery made it through the lines. Even people back then were calling out the garbage. But a lot of these books went through anyways because you couldn't get your hands on all of them to disprove them, right? It's not like they had an internet and everybody was posting all of these works out there so that you could analyze them and critique them. That wasn't happening. Right? So if somebody had a forged document, they would give that forged document to the appropriate parties, then they would get their land in return, and then, not a lot of people are really going to know about that. Obviously, the larger forgeries more people knew about, for example, the donation of Constantine, that's a good one. That obviously comes into way more question, and there's other problems, but even documents like that still make it through. So in this part of the book, basically what he is saying is that Alexander the Great, the one that, is very popular and famous in history nowadays, the claim is that he technically never existed. Now, how do you like that? And there is scientific evidence to support this claim, that Alexander the Great is simply a phantom duplicate of Mehmed II. All right, let's keep going. Once again, that's placing a heavy load on coincidence's back. In the light of the previous chapters, any reasonable person studying the facts with a cool head would probably express puzzlement at the sheer amount of events repeating in their general traits after approximately 1800 years. So, if the theory is false, this 1800-year theory, if it is false, one is left with the onus of explaining why Greek history consistently duplicates its general features after a magical cycle of 18 centuries. The fact that the ages of the besiegers of Byzantium and Constantinople when they died are matching, or that the ages of their respective sons when they took the city are matching too, for example, may be judged anecdotal. On the other hand, that such an important event as the spread of Greek people as well as their culture at a massive scale should repeat in the world's history in very similar circumstances is far from being anecdotal. In the same vein, the two men virtually sharing the same name, Alexander and Skanderberg, are both remembered as outstanding military commanders in the same part of the world with a time gap of 1800 years is also far from being anecdotal. Again, the same major blueprint replicates after nearly 2 millennia in very similar circumstances seems unlikely at the very least. But if we recognize that our conventional chronology is flawed, meaning that the older set of events is merely the phantom duplicate of the second set of events, which truly occurred only once in history, not twice, then there is no mystery anymore. The key here is going to be 1800 years. So you can actually go and test this theory for yourself. If you go to the Renaissance period, find an event that happened, 1537 or whatever, it doesn't matter, pick an event. Then go back to the Hellenistic period in ancient Greece and see if you can find a similar event. Now, I've done this, and sure enough, it's crazy, man. You start to find similarities between this 1800-year time gap. So there's something going on here, right? You can't ignore it. There's nothing we can do about that. You can say coincidence, but I don't, it's too many coincidences, like way too many. It's insane how many coincidences there are. And then you just throw into the mix that we know for a fact that a lot of this stuff was fabricated anyway. I mean, what do you want from me? This is the direction that we're heading. All right, last section, and then we'll shut this garbage show down. All right, so some more proof. All right, you guys ready for this? This section is called the Greek Tragedians. The golden age of Greek tragedy, which lasted about 80 years, occurred in the 5th century BC. But the first tragic contests are thought to have taken place slightly earlier, in 534 BC. During the Dionysia, an Athenian festival in honor of Dionysus, under the rule of Pisistratus. I can't read for crap, obviously. Pisistratus. See, look at that. I'm getting better live. Okay, Pisistratus. The most famous Greek tragedians who lived mainly in the following century are Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. Let us posit that the conventional dates of, quote, ancient Greece are 1800 years too early. This would mean that the first tragedy truly occurred in 1266 AD. At this time in Western Europe, people would play liturgical dramas, that is, short plays whose subjects were borrowed from the Bible or from the lives of saints, miracles, generally theatrical compositions in verse with some divine element, as well as monologues and comedies. Adding 1800 years would have Aeschylus die in 1344, and Euripides and Sophocles both would be dead in 1394. In other words, if our hypothesis is correct, these three tragedians might have died as late as the 14th century AD. What's interesting to note is that the first secular tragedians of the West, in Italy, France, England, Spain, and Portugal, these appear to have emerged the following century, i.e. in the 15th century. For example, Arnoul Grebon and his brother Simon were among the first French dramatists in the 15th century. They wrote so-called mysteries, in which the supernatural elements played some role, but at the same time they were quite realistic. In Portugal, Gil Vicente is often credited as the father of Portuguese drama, or even of Iberian theater in general, since he also wrote in Spanish. At the end of the same period, Juan del Encina is also viewed as the founder of Iberian drama. His dramatic plays marking a transition between religious dramas and purely secular plays. How curious is it that Western drama made, well, such a dramatic return from religious to more secular plays in the 15th and early 16th centuries, right after what could have been the real time of Greek tragedians. Redating Greek tragedians solves the mystery, as Western dramatists might have been influenced by the Greeks if those truly lived just a few decades before them. So basically what they're saying is they're saying that there is a natural progression in a smaller period of time on how plays would have gone through their evolutionary situation. So what you find is that you find the Greeks start writing all their tragedy and stuff down there in Italy in the Renaissance period, earlier in the Renaissance period. Those tragedies, they slowly start to spread out from, Italy, Greece. And as they spread out, it starts to change the way people write. So at first, people start using these tragedians, and then the next generation of writers or playwriters, those guys show up and they want to start moving away from those. So you go from tragedy and then it morphs into the secular situation. Basically, we find ourselves with a legitimate and a believable evolutionary time frame for people writing plays. Instead of, all the tragedies being written 1800 years ago, then a huge gap, and then suddenly the tragedies come back into style, and then the tragedies then lead into another kind of playwright style that doesn't even make sense. Really? So 1800 years, there's a gap, and then people just magically pick right back up in the evolution of culture in writing? Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. Because why would they even know about this stuff? Well, they found all those books hidden in libraries underneath people's cellars magically. It doesn't work. It's all garbage. The reality is when we start to look back at history, we find so many events that are literally just phantom duplicates of events that happened that are way closer to us today. I mean, everywhere you look, they're there. It's funny that mainstream historians don't pay attention to this at all, because this conclusion is being made by using actual science, right? By actually sitting there, looking at the evidence, being honest about the evidence and objective, and then just following it where it takes us. So in this little bit that I just read here to you guys, and yeah, I know I suck at reading. I'm trying to get better, okay? Just leave me alone. I'm doing it. But anyway, what we have here is we have more evidence of entire, centuries, a millennia plus, being added to our mainstream historical narrative, and it's only there due to fraudulent claims. That's it. That's all it's there for. And mainstream historians completely ignore this possibility. Right? They don't want anything to do with it. They honestly believe that for whatever reason, in the Mediterranean European area, history literally pauses itself for 1,000 years or 1,800 years, depending on where you are at geologically. That doesn't work. Come on, that's insane. If anybody else, you could not go into a courtroom right now and present this evidence and actually have the judge say, yeah, you're right, there's definitely 1,800 year gap here. This makes perfect sense. No, you would be executed. The judge would look at you. He would be disgusted by the fact that you're wasting his time, and then you're just dead, right? And he just order you to be executed because it's stupid. You can't just, all right, let's do a quick recap, and then we can get back to life and, enjoying the suck. All right, so basically, this is what we've got. We find that Philip II of Macedon besieged Byzantium in, quote, ancient times, and Murad II, an Ottoman, besieged Constantinople some 1,800 years later. Both Philip II and Murad II lived until age 46. Byzantium fell under Alexander the Great, who was Philip II's son, while Constantinople fell some 1,800 years later under Mehmed II, who was Murad II's son. Alexander the Great was 22 when he took Byzantium, while Mehmed II was 21 when he took Constantinople. Alexander the Great might be the phantom duplicate of Skanderberg, a 15th century military commander who is today considered as a national hero in Albania. Athens fell under the Macedonians a few years after Byzantium, and Athens fell again under the Ottomans a few years after Constantinople some 1800 years later. The fall of Byzantium and Athens spawned the diffusion of Greek culture around the Mediterranean, an era now called the Hellenistic period. And the fall of Constantinople and Athens some 1800 years later triggered a wave of Greek emigres and the translation of ancient Greek books in the West, an era now dubbed the Renaissance. The evidence suggests that the ancient events leading to the Hellenistic period are the phantom reflection of events that really took place in the 15th century AD, today called the Renaissance. The first Western dramatists emerged some 1,850 to 1,900 years after the Greek tragedians, or just 500 to 100 years after them when redating ancient Greek tragedy. So basically what we find here is that we are finding the Hellenistic period is just a duplicate, a phantom duplicate of the Renaissance period. So all those Renaissance authors, what they did basically is they looked around at their surroundings. They took inspiration basically from what they knew. And that's what writers do. You know, it's how it works. And they took that inspiration from what was going on around them then, and then they just tweaked names, threw them backwards in time 1,800 years, and suddenly created an entirely new history. When this was done, this allowed the floodgates for people to open to do all kinds of corrupt stuff. Right? This was an era where the power grabs really started going on, and these power grabs basically created the world that we live in today. There's probably the vast majority of people in power today, if not everybody in power, they basically got all of their foundations built on lies, right? On forgeries, on all of this stuff, right? The claims to thrones, for example, that people have nowadays, this is where all of this stems from. This is why it's actually extraordinarily important to know real chronology, because this actually has the capacity to change entire society structure right now. Because of all of these people are ruling based on lies. You know, like, for example, you know, the Vatican. The reality is those guys got their power from the donation of Constantine. The donation of Constantine is now officially looked at as a forgery by mainstream historians. Did the Pope and his buddies bow down? Did they step out of their position of power? No, of course not. They're still there. They're still running things. Even though we know for a fact that how they got there was fraudulent, they are still in control. How do you like that for psychological conditioning? That's how you know that you have beaten a population down to where you can look them in the face and say, yeah, I'm in power due to forgeries. What are you going to do about it? And the answer is nothing. I mean, that's the unfortunate reality, right? We know for a fact that there is a corrupt power structure that actually has a huge say in worldwide politics and stuff like that nowadays, and nobody does anything. I mean, it's crazy. Like, it's absolutely insane. So when anybody ever thinks that you know, you can't be psychologically conditioned, oh yeah, everybody can be psychologically conditioned. Okay, anyway, so that we're gonna end it here. You guys get it. So basically, right now, what we have is we have a lot of evidence that supports the fact that there is an 1,800-year fictitious block of time that has been added to mainstream chronology. And yeah, I'm also well aware that this claim completely changes everything, because that means that also starts to change Egyptian dating. It changes Rome dating. I mean, it changes everything. Now, initially, this sounds insane. I get it. But, you know, the reality is this actually gives us an opportunity to be free, because if we can shed those shackles of mainstream garbage history, suddenly we are now put into a position to where we can look at history through a real critical eye, and we can start to gain a real understanding of what happened back in the day. And this is important. This is extraordinarily critical for everybody to understand. This has to be done. All right. That's you get it. I'm babbling now, whatever. Okay, so we'll keep going with this. Don't worry, there's tons more proof for this. And like I said, if you want to do an experiment yourself, go pick a Renaissance date, doesn't matter, and then go look 1,800 years backwards relative to mainstream chronology and see if you can't locate a phantom duplicate. I've done this. It's actually very interesting. There's a lot of them there. All right, so okay. All right, we're done. All right, go do something with your life. I got stuff to do anyway. Okay.